Welcome, everybody, to my lecture. So, my name is Gregory Moss, as many of you know, and the title of my lecture, I apologize, I changed it at the last minute to Nishida's Absolute Dialetheism. So, I will be talking about Nishida and Nishida alone the for the whole talk. Okay, so I want to go ahead and jump in. I'd like to begin by making a comment about Nishida's philosophy. We discover when we look at many of Nishida's texts that all things are contradictory. A brief gander at his text indicates this. And by contradictory here I mean what Nishida often says it means, which is the self-identity of opposites. In Basho, Nishida says, the Basho wherein is in place the self-identical, or rather what endlessly contains contradictory development within itself, is what I call the Basho of true nothing. He also calls the present a self-contradictory movement. In Logic and Life, he says that our self exists in the historical world as self-contradictory existence. He says that judgment is established as a unity of contradiction, and the object of judgment is always contradictory. He says even empirical concepts like colors are contradictory. The fact that red is a color is self-contradictory. He says most generally reality itself is a contradiction. Quoting him, actuality is the self-contradiction of the absolute. It is actual because it is absolutely self-contradictory. He says God, or the absolute, is also a contradiction. From nothingness in religious worldview, God is an absolutely paradoxical fact and an identity of absolute contradiction. So we could keep finding other examples throughout, but I think we've made the point pretty clear. We can see from this brief look at a few of Nishida's texts and passages that all of existence is constituted by contradiction. First, actuality is self-contradictory and has its self-contradictory constitution, or being, because of the self-contradiction of the absolute. In addition, it is not just God or the absolute that is contradictory, but even mundane empirical concepts too, such as red. Whether the beings and concepts we are dealing with are relative or absolute, they are contradictory, and they are in virtue of that self-contradiction. Indeed, even that which we expect to be self-consistent most of all, such as judgments and acts of cognition, are only true if they are self-contradictory. This view, which holds that all things are self-contradictory, I call absolute dialetheism. Dialetheism holds that some contradictions are true. Dialetheism becomes absolute when that which is all-inclusive, the absolute, is a true contradiction. The aim of this presentation is to reconstruct in brief but systematic outline why absolute dialetheism is true on Nishida's terms. In order to explicate Nishida's absolute dialetheism, I will draw Nishida's thought into dialogue with Hegel's logic of self-contradiction. This approach is not completely ad hoc but endemic to Nishida's study in Basho. As Nishida writes, Basho, how then would the consciousness of contradiction be established? Logically, we would have no choice but to simply think of something like Hegel's concept that goes on developing via contradiction. Close quote. Our clue to unraveling Nishida's absolute dialetheism is, in part anyway, the Hegelian concept. The consciousness of contradiction achieved by Nishida can be achieved by us too, if we attend to the structural similarity between Hegel's logic of the concept and the structure of Basho or place in Nishida. Although that won't be sufficient because Nishida has his own critique of Hegel and his own dialectic of paradox, or logic of paradox. We have good reason to look to Hegel, for Hegel, like Nishida, is also an absolute dialethist. Hegel proclaims that, quote, every determination, anything concrete, every concept is essentially a unity of distinguished and distinguishable elements which, by virtue of the determinate essential difference, pass over into elements which are contradictory, close quote. Hegel also famously says that contradiction is the moving principle of the world, close quote. Because Hegel, like Nishida, takes all determinations to be contradictory, we must challenge ourselves to uncover the difference between them and how they can illuminate one another. Because here the main concern is with the logical form of Nishida's absolute philosophy and its contradictory aspect, I will give special attention to the Basho essay, since it lays bare the logical form of his thinking in an attempt to overcome any objections that he is perpetuating or was perpetuating a form of psychologism. As will become clearer, this logical form can be well illustrated by keeping an eye towards Hegel's logic of the concept and the phenomenology of the concept, which for Hegel is an inherently contradictory principle without which the world would not exist. So with that said, we have the general overall trajectory of the paper, and I'd like to go ahead and jump into part two, which is the formulation of the problem. So everything that exists in some basho, in some place. When we ask about the being of something, what is X? We can answer by saying X is such and such. And by saying X is such and such, we're placing X in some domain, with such and such expressing a predicate that corresponds with that domain. The such and such is the basho, the predicate corresponding to the domain in which the thing exists. There is nothing outside a basho. Whenever I say, what is X? Whenever I answer X is such and such, I place X in a basho. What is basho? Most particularly, it is a predicate of the judgment, S is P. Or here we can think of it as P is U, the particular is universal, whereby the subject is the particular and placed in the predicate. The predicate is the universal, so we can express this to mean that P is U, the particular is universal. The universal is the place within which the particular is discovered. This reminds us most intimately of the genus concept, rather than the class concept or the abstraction. The genus is a universal, but not any kind of universal, one which includes its particulars within itself. So whenever we uncover the genus, we find particulars immanent within it. The genus of mammals, for example, contains particular kinds of mammals. Now, of import here is to note already that this concept of universal deviates from Kant's abstract universal, that is opposed to intuition. Intuition, we'll remember, contains its instances, while concepts subsume the instances. This division is already contrary to Basho, for Basho envelops its differences like intuition does. But the basho, which is a predicate, also instantiates itself in the particulars, as well as including them within itself. This basho is already a unity, therefore, of particular and universal, and combines aspects of the intuitive and the spontaneous in Kant. But although this preliminary discussion motivates our inquiry, there is still a deeper sense of basho than any generic, non-abstract concept. It is the concrete universal of Hegel, which is self-particularizing and self-differentiating. So we need to be able to see how we can arrive at this concept from the generic one. The genus does not account for the presence of the particular. It is simply discovered there. So Nishida tells us that everything is generated from nothing. It certainly means more than a generic universal. Since nothing, both as relative and absolute nothing, are bashos for Nishida, the basho must do more than simply contain its particulars. It must account for the particularization itself, out of nothing. So basho must ultimately have the power to particularize. It must be able to work or be at work. The working of basho is central to its concrete universality and is more than the being unified of particular and universal in the genus. So if we continue to think about what bashos are, we find that the particular emplaced by a universal, P is U, itself must also be emplaced in some basho. I can ask, what is the universal P is U emplaced in? If the universal is determinate, it is relative to others, this versus that universal. As a determinate universal, it is relative to others, this universal versus that universal. So we can ask, here we have two universals, this and that universal. Each is determinate and relative to others. Each contains particulars in which they are emplaced. Since these universals, this universal, that universal, are bashos, they are relative. Again, they may be mathematical or empirical bashos. They must be emplaced, nonetheless, in some higher universal. Why? Each relative or determinate universal is this or that, particular or one in number, and thus must be in some higher universal, exactly because particulars are instances of universals and are emplaced in bashos. But this is also clear from the fact that every relative universal has something in common with other relative universals, Namely, they're both relative universals, or they're all relative universals. And so any relative universal or relative Basho would exist in the place of relative universality. It seems, though, that ultimately all relative universals must be placed in other relative universals until we come to an all-encompassing universal, the absolute Basho, the Basho of all Bashos. First, we must see why this is nothing, after which it will be clear that all relative Bashos are relative nothings. The highest Basho cannot be anything. If it were this, either a thing or an activity, if it were a determinate thing or act, it would be relative to something else. But in fact, the absolute Basho can only be something indeterminate. So the highest genus, or the absolute Basho, must be something absolutely indeterminate. Again, why is that? The determinate is what one answers with what isn't. It is this contra that. Anytime we answer with what, we provide some difference, in virtue of which something is different from something else. And that is essential or fundamental to determinacy. So what we see is that every time we talk about a relative Basho, or relative universality, we're placing it in relative universality. We're placing it in the Basho of relative universality, or relative Basho. And the relative Basho as such, insofar as it includes all relative Bashos, or all relative universals, itself is not relative to anything. All relative beings are in it, and so it itself is not relative to anything else. Or insofar as all differences are in it, it is not different from anything else. So determinate Basho, relative Basho, differentiated Basho isn't different from anything else because it contains all the differences. And so it itself must be indistinct, non-differentiated, indeterminate. But what is the indistinct? It is nothing, for one cannot contrast the indistinct with anything. If that in which all relative Bashos are placed, relative that which is a relative Basho as such, and it itself is not relative to anything or different from anything, then it is undifferentiated, and it is without any difference. And that which is undifferentiated or without difference is not different from nothing. And so we see that the highest Basho, whatever it is, cannot be relative to anything else or different from anything else, and therefore cannot be distinct from nothing. As we climb the ladder from beings and placed, we arrive at what is absolutely nothing. So we have determinate beings and absolute nothingness. But these are not sufficient, of course, to grasp the variety of ways in which Nishida's Bashos are organized. There is also what is relatively nothing. The absolute nothing, the indeterminate nothing, is identical with being. Here, Nishida cites, actually, Hegel's Science of Logic, where Hegel says that indeterminate being is identical with indeterminate nothing. And what we see is that the absolute nothing is instantiated at every level of judgment and predication. P is U means now that each being, each particular place, which as we remember is this or that, Basho, is now an instance of nothing. Each particular instantiates absolute nothing. And since each particular Basho is this or that, each is a relative nothing. So we have each universal, each Basho, this or that universal, is a determinate being, a species of the highest genus, is also a determinate nothingness, a nothing that is relative to other nothings, or to have a distinct term, a negative nothing, a negation in place within a negation, until we arrive at absolute nothingness. So here there is a key insight also visible in Hegel. Determinate being is a determinate nothing. They are what Hegel and Nishida will also call qualities. They are instantiated by quality as such, another term Nishida employs to discuss the root of all reality. We find a further point that each relative or oppositional negation or nothing is negated when we arrive at absolute nothing. In order to rise from relative to absolute nothingness, we must negate the relative negations. So each relative Basho is a relative nothing. It's relative nothing because it is opposed to some being. And it itself has a being that stands in opposition, whereas absolute nothingness is in opposition to nothing, but envelops being and nothing within itself. But absolute nothingness is the negation of negation. This means that we have three stages generally, very roughly. Particulars are beings emplaced in Bashos. We have the Bashos in which they're emplaced as relative nothings. The relative oppositional nothing must be itself emplaced in the absolute nothing, which is the highest genus, the most enveloping genus. And this term negation of negation is, of course, also a technical term from Hegel, which Hegel uses to describe the concrete universal, which for him is singularity. And it is, of course, a term that applies, or that Hegel applies throughout his science of logic to discuss or to describe the self-differentiations of universality and the concept in general. So, to say it a little more, these levels indicate even the following. Even the beings, or the particulars, instantiating the lowest level of relative determinations are transformed into nothing, because they too are emplaced in nothings. Right? So even the particulars in the relative Bashos are instantiations of some kind of nothingness. So we have begun with beings, and we conclude with absolutely nothing. But note, the disappearance of beings into nothing shows the Hegelian formula of negation of negation. But so far it is only an abstract consideration, since so far we have not shown how this absolute nothing differentiates itself or determines itself. And Nishida is clear that when he says that ultimately everything is nothing, he doesn't mean that there are no beings. That's not what he means. So we have this problem. Given that all beings have become nothing by being placed in nothing, how is it possible that there is anything at all? We have lost all beings in nothing. So we must ask, how is it possible for there to be beings, given that all beings are placed in nothing? And we've so far been pursuing our thinking from the particular to the universal, rather than in the other direction. So at this point, I want to take a step back, and I want to reflect upon this question that we've arrived at. All beings are placed in Bashos. They're placed in relative Bashos, and then ultimately in the Basho of absolute nothingness. This Basho of absolute nothingness then seems to nullify all beings, and so we have this question, how is it possible for us to get beings, or differentiated relative finite determinations, from the absolute nothingness, or the highest genus? How can we get one from the other? And interesting that of course, in the literature and in the commentaries on Nishida, a few different commentators have pointed out that there is this problem of difference in Nishida's early philosophy, especially from the inquiry into the good. Namely that he describes the position of the absolute from the perspective of pure experience, where there's no meaning and there's no deliberative discrimination. And so many people have pointed out that we have this problem. Exactly how are we going to get the separation between subject and object that's constitutive of the opposition of consciousness from pure experience? And then once we ask that question in a more general way, in a more using terms that don't overtly refer to consciousness, we can ask how in principle is difference possible, given that all beings are placed in absolute nothing, which is nothing at all, which has no determination, no difference. How is it that difference can come from what has no difference? Right? So we can ask this very same question in terms of the logical positioning of Nishida's Basho essay. So Nishida, of course, even in his earlier works before Basho, is trying to give an account of this, intuition, self-awareness. In other places, he appeals, of course, to Fichte, into the will. And this reference to Fichte, of course, also gives us a hint about the overall structure and placement of the problematic in Nishida's thought. The problem of the origin of difference is not just a problem that arises with Nishida, but it is a problem that is endemic to the history of German idealism. So I want to read a few quotes from Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all of whom raise this problem of the origin of difference. And it is a problem that is analogous to the problematic that we've uncovered here in Nishida. And so we can see that Nishida really, in a certain way, belongs within the horizon of the problems that are stemming from German idealism. Schlegel asks, why has the infinite gone out of itself and made itself finite? Fichte asks, when the I originally posits itself, how does it then come to posit something different? Question mark. Hegel says the essence of philosophy has often been located by those already adept in the things of thought, in the task of answering the question, how does the infinite go forth out of itself and come to finitude? Schelling asks in his philosophical letters, I believe that the very transition from the non-finite to the finite is the problem of all philosophy, not just one particular system. And this, of course, for Schelling, he says, is the problem of the very existence of the world. So we see a series of problems which are structurally analogous to Nishida's. Nishida himself seems to share the problem of German idealism, even if he doesn't share the solution. We have now a new formulation of the question. How does absolute nothingness go forth out of itself and into finitude? Why has the absolute nothingness gone out of itself and made itself relative, a relative nothing? So this is part two. What I want to finish with part two is a statement of a question, a statement of a problem, which we can see is analogous with a certain structural problem we see in German idealism. So Nishida's drawing upon Hegel is connected to the fact that he is responding to a similar set of problems for which Hegel's concept was originally designed. So Hegel's concept is originally designed to answer this question, the concept of the concrete universal, and Nishida seems to be drawing upon it in order to answer this question himself, albeit in a different way. Nishida's philosophy can be understood as regards as problematic within the horizon of problems endemic to and essential for German idealism, at least in part, of course, not completely. There's other dimensions that are not reducible to this tradition, so I don't mean to make any kind of reductive claim here, but rather to shed light on a very important aspect of Nishida's philosophy. As Alve and Ives also put it, Nishida transformed Western philosophy into a Zen-oriented philosophy. And applying this to a specific example, we can ask, how does Nishida transform Hegel's dialectics into a Zen-oriented philosophy? Or does he? And how does he do that? Okay, so that's part two, the question, the structural analogy with German idealism. And now I want to briefly talk about his answer to the question. Before we jump into the answer to the question, I would like to point out that Nishida has a profound understanding of what has enabled us to formulate the question. And what has enabled us to formulate the question this way is that we have been engaged in withdrawal into thought, and we've been engaged in acts of negation. We have moved abstractly, and when we do this, we negate, and what is engendered is a withdrawal. But Nishida sees the withdrawal endemic to philosophy as constitutive of the fields, or the Bashos, for they themselves are negations. They are themselves nothings. So what's really interesting here is that I am only able to withdraw via thought because thought in itself is constituted by negation. Universality in itself is a kind of nothing, and this is what enables withdrawal, and especially the withdrawal of abstract thought. We proceed negatively because thoughts are themselves constituted by the negative. So what we see here is a unity of method and content. The method of withdrawal, the method of abstraction always involves negation, and that's possible because the very contents upon which we work are themselves negative or nothings already. So we have this unity of method and content, which enables the withdrawal into absolute nothing, and therefore enables the positing of the question. But Nishida has more to say about the relation between universal and particular as a kind of nothing. And I want to read a quote here. I'm not reading a lot of quotes. I'm saving them for the discussion in case they're useful. He says, Nishida says in the Basho essay, for the particular, the universal carries no sense of being at all. It is completely nothing. And the universal establishes the particular within, just as it is and without distortion. And for Nishida, this is a process of what he calls mirroring. To mirror means to let the thing stand, to receive it as it is, without distorting its form. So somehow the universal for the particular is nothing, and it is what establishes the particular, its existence, and what allows it to reveal what it is without distortion. Now, why is that? for Nishida, what's really interesting is the universal, as we pointed out already, is a kind of nothingness. That's what allows the withdrawal. That's what allows already the positing of the question. That's what allows the negation. The universal, we can see, is, we often think of it as a common term. But what that indicates is that it's neither, it's none of the particulars that fall under it. So the universal then is neither this nor that, right? And so the universal becomes a neither nor. And as a neither nor, we can see that it's a kind of negation. It is not, it seems, responsible at first for its differences. So its determinacy does not stand out alongside the particulars that it contains. So we don't find in the genus of human being, for example, humans and then the concept of humanity, right? The concept of humanity itself is not a man, right? And so the fact that the concept is not here its own particular, standing alongside the other particulars, indicates that in a way it has receded in order that the particulars may be revealed. Now, even if it is the case that a human being itself is not a human, at the level of the concept of the human being, the concept of the human being is one particular among others, right? And that it itself would appear within a Basho, a universal, that is itself a neither nor. And what is this neither nor? This neither nor is a kind of indeterminacy, right? The determinacy of the universal does not show up among the particulars. It does not stand out alongside them. So what we have are these, one could say, layers of indeterminacy. The neither nor, what does not differentiate among the particulars, is something that is not discriminatory, is not determinate. And of course, at all levels except for the absolute nothingness, the universal is a relative nothing, not an absolute nothing, because it may be a nothing in regard to the particulars that fall under it, but it is something in regard to the Basho in which it is emplaced. This, is, of course, is the case all the way until we get to the absolute nothing, which is not emplaced in anything else. This would be a neither nor that is absolutely nothing, rather than relatively nothing. So for Nishida, though, this nothingness or indeterminacy of the universal is exactly what allows the particular to be revealed. So he says each universal is a relative nothing that enables the existence of the particular that is emplaced in it. We discover that the universal allows the revelation of the particular because it is itself indeterminate nothing. By being a nothing, it allows the particular to be what it is. But again, so far we've only been evoking abstract considerations, and if we continue to only think of the universal like this, what happens is we end up with the problem, which is important. Without the problem, we can't get to the solution, but we lose the whole world disappears. And as Schelling says, the problem of philosophy is that it makes the whole world disappear, and part of the job of philosophy is somehow to find our way back to it again. So this problem that we've arrived at, this problem of the disappearance of all things, is also, one could say, the problem of contradiction. That really absolute nothingness is a contradiction. Why is that? Well, we see the clue to this in the formulation negation of negation. The negation of negation is a statement that engenders a contradiction. Absolute nothing is nothing. It is pure being and pure nothing. It is the predicate of all predicates, but it is also beyond every single predicate. Or better, when we look towards the absolute place, we see a contradiction. We achieve consciousness of contradiction. Now, why is that? We see that the absolute Basho is the negative of the negative. It is absolute negativity, and it is not the relative. And the relative is a relative negation. It is this negation versus that negation. But when we look at it like this, what happens then is we make the absolute negation relative to relative negation. And therefore the absolute becomes relative to the relative and is no longer absolute anymore. And so when we think the absolute as a negation of negation, we find ourselves in contradiction inevitably. Or to say, oh, the absolute is indeterminate. And by making the claim, of course, we contrast the indeterminate with the determinate, and therefore the indeterminate becomes the determinate and is no longer indeterminate. Or it is both indeterminate and determinate, right? So it is both the predicate of all predicates and it's no predicate at all. So whenever I proclaim absolute nothingness to be a negation of negation, I oppose it to negation and render absolute nothingness into a relative nothing. Or as I said, the indeterminate into a determinate something. The experience of contradiction here is something I always encounter whenever I try to raise the absolute nothingness into the plane of predication, or whenever I try to raise the plane of predication into the plane of absolute nothingness. Experience of contradiction is the encounter with that which transcends all relative determination, but yet is only describable in terms of relative determinations, such as categories and words. So at first it seems that this may be a problem that is only isolated to the absolute, but in fact, if every relative nothing is an instantiation of the highest genus, then the absolute contradiction that obtains the level of the highest genus will then apply at every level of every species, of every other Basho. And so we'd have contradiction applying everywhere and at all times. Now, Nishida seems to indicate that the absolute nothingness, that is contradictory, is in some fundamental sense non-rational. And this is one of the important differences between Nishida and Hegel. Unlike Hegel, Nishida calls this absolute nothingness the non-rational that undergirds all reason. Rather than proclaim reason to be contradictory, or rather than attempt to develop a dialectic that never goes beyond reason, that stays within the confines of reason, Nishida wants to expand this dialectic in such a way that it transcends reason and in fact makes it possible. So just to give a couple indications of this, Nishida points out that as regards the negation of negation, he says it is ultimately the non-rational and everything rational is placed in it. So one of the critiques, of course, of Hegel's dialectic is that it is an objective dialectic. It's somehow immanent, but it's somehow failing to achieve the status of transcendence that we see in Nishida's philosophy. If we think along with Nishida that contradictions, as he says here, are unthinkable, he says to think a contradiction is to negate logic itself. We are unable to think of that which is contradictory. Or earlier in the inquiry into the good, the truth cannot be expressed in words. We end up seeing, or that, as he says later on, truth logic is paradoxical, that it seems that the concepts themselves are governed by non-contradiction. And so once we inevitably come to a contradiction, we have a violation of logical form. So it seems as though the absolute nothingness is a kind of violation of absolute logical form. Of logical form. It is a violation of logical form such that absolute nothingness somehow transcends reason, transcends the concept, whereas Hegel's dialectic remains within the concept. Right? Hegel wants the concept to be coextensive in a way with the absolute. He doesn't think that the dialectic of reason needs to move to the non-rational and then come back to reason. Whereas according to Nishida, the non-rational itself seems to be the middle term. So this is one of the very important differences, it seems, in the way in which Nishida will proceed contra Hegel. But how do we answer the question? And we won't be able to go into a lot of detail because I'm running out of time already. But I'll just briefly indicate how I understand this to work. In our previous reflections, we've transcended the particular and disappeared into the universal. All that is the absolute genus, absolute nothingness. But how do we develop particulars out of the genus beyond genera? The hint is, of course, the emptiness of emptiness, or Hegel's negation of negation. We have to see that the absolute is nothing. Being has disappeared. But what is present? Nothingness is nothing. It has no being. It has no being that stands apart from anything else. But this means that nothingness is inseparable from everything that it is not. As indistinct, it is indistinct from differentiations or beings. So by negating itself, nothing becomes empty of its own nothingness and is thereby something. The universal empties itself of its own being and thereby gives particular relative nothings in somethings. So in short, nothingness is not nothing means nothingness is something. But what is something that comes to be from nothing? It is a creation ex nihilo. It is a specific kind of nothing, the creation of the self-determination of nothing, the coming to be of all relative negations. By emptying itself of its own emptiness, beings arise, beings which are differentiations of nothingness. So rather than P is U, we have U is P. U is P, or the universal is particular, is the formula of the will, he says, which is the power of self-particularization. The absolute nothingness, insofar as it is the ground of the differentiations, is principle of self-activity, or what he calls the will. So Nishida inserts the will in between pure intuition and cognition, between absolute genus and its species. Why call it will? Well, on the one hand, it's the act of self-determination that constitutes the freedom. On the other hand, it is at work on itself. It negates itself, and by working via self-negation, it is the power that forms itself into relative negations. Thus, Nishida is indeed justified in speaking of self-differentiation, self-negation, and self-determination, all of which are terms for the being at work of absolute nothingness in the creation ex nihilo, and thus ex absoluto, out of itself. So the universal divides and negates itself, thus generating universals, Bashos, beings that are relative to each other. And this is the concrete universal of Hegel, or the self-particularizing universal. Hegel's universal is self-particularizing. The self-particularizing universal, which, as we'll see, is also such that the whole is in every element of the whole, which is also the case with Nishida's understanding of the self-particularization of absolute nothingness. Since it empties itself completely, it vanishes into the particular. This is the true substance, and what is meant to be truly at work. The emptiness, non-substantial being of all things is now transformed into the power of self-negation by which the world exists. So the series of emplacements in which P is U has its origin in the reverse process of the will, whereby U is P, emptying itself in the direction of particularity. But because particularity now occupies the predicate position, it's also emptying itself in the direction of predication. But note here the dialectical result. The self-negating process out of nothing negates itself. The negation of negation negates itself and gives us the negation of the negation of negation, the relative negation. So we have absolute nothingness and its self-externality, or its expression, the particular universal. Here, of course, Nishida introduces the concept of force. The will is the principal origin of the force, of which Nishida speaks. Force is a power of self-externalization that creates series of emplacements. All force, following Hegel, has an expression, and this is clear enough from the phenomenology of spirit. Each Basho is an expression of the force of the will that is ceaselessly externalizing itself, or emptying itself into particularity. Because the subject empties itself into the relative particular universal, the relative Basho is the absolute, but now with the qualification, the absolute nothing exists in the form of the relative, in the form of a particular Basho, as this Basho. So the force by which nothingness empties itself is not only expressed in the relative Basho, it is the relative Basho itself. The self-expression of the absolute is both the expression and the force of the absolute itself. So consistency exists, but it exists as the self-alienation or self-othering of the inconsistent absolute. Right? So here we have Hegel's inverted world, where the inconsistent is not the inversion of the consistent, but the consistent is the inversion of the inconsistent. So what we see then, at the end, is that the concept of Basho is a contradictory concept of self-emplacement, a contradictory being that makes possible and undergirds all consistent and abstract reflections. This is Nishida's absolute dialetheism. Now, this absolute dialetheism, I'm not able to go into all the details here, in particular to show why the will itself must be overcome by absolute nothingness, or to speak into more detail about why Nishida's philosophy is not a mysticism, which is something that I think we should talk about. We see, in fact, as we work through Nishida's absolute dialetheism, that every relative determination of the absolute genus is constituted by the force of self-expulsion. Absolute nothingness is at work negating itself. The relative Bashos carry the force, or better, are constituted as lines of force that have their own expressions, their own particulars that are in place within them. Force in its expression is self-contradictory. The will that creates it is a self-contradictory identity, as Nishida states. The universal and the absolute nothing is particular, relative nothing, and the activity whereby the absolute becomes particular is force, a force extending throughout all existence, encompassing all beings in all Bashos. If, of course, the absolute were not relative, then it would be opposed to the relative and would not be absolute. So the only way that the absolute can be absolute is if it is also relative. So we see here this absolute dialetheism that is engendered through this concrete universal of self-particularization, which Nishida here in the Basho essay characterizes as will. Now, because absolute nothingness is always self-transcending, it must also transcend the will, as well as intuition, as well as any term or description that one may give it. And so for this reason, one may be concerned that here we have mysticism. Now, Nishida has a very nice and clean argument about why the will has to be overcome, or why it is that absolute nothingness transcends the will, which I'll put on hold for now. And I will finish up by pointing out why I think, actually, that Nishida's absolute dialetheism is not mysticism. As he says, it's not a mysticism in his later work, even if in the early work it seemed that it was one. I want to briefly say something about why I think it isn't a mysticism, even though everything we say about it ends up failing. Briefly, because absolute nothingness is empty of all determinations, even will and intuition, it is immanent in all and without limit. Because it stands by itself, nothing can contradict it. Thus, it is without contradiction. This means that absolute nothingness has contradicted the contradiction of the will, and we return to the self-identity of the absolute, what is independent. To put it another way, because the universal has been emptied of all determinate predicates, there is no predicate in relation to which the absolute can stand in contradiction. It is that which stands outside the possibility of contradiction. It is the undeniable. So then everything is inverted again. So Nishida is right to deny that his work is mystical, since no ineffable ground lies beyond the world of the effable. If it did, the ineffable would be effable. Rather, the absolute nothingness is all one encounters, but as effable, as determinate universals, so that by transcending determinate universality into absolute nothingness, one realizes that one has never left the plane of determination, the plane of determinate predicates and bashas. As he says, they're not abolished, but they're deepened or they're exhausted. The absolute shines so bright that one might not see it at all, and one may only believe its children to be real, namely the relative determinations that it illuminates. It hides in its ubiquity and presence, the one and all. So the theory does not fall victim, it seems to me, to the complaint that everything is true and false, in the sense that everything and anything follows from a contradiction, or that everything is trivial. Rather, the true contradiction is that the contradiction eliminates itself, leaving us with a determinate world. That is, the contradiction of contradiction. Accordingly, we must blow up determinacy, and then blow up that blowing up. Negate negation of determinacy, and return to determinacy of the predicative plane. We negate rationality and its negation, namely irrationality, to arrive at a rationality that is mediated, however, by the irrational, something which Nishida thinks Hegel did not achieve. And I leave aside then any further comments or last comments about world spirit or about the self, which I also meant to speak about, but I've run out of time. And I'll just briefly mention, I think, one of the interesting prospects for a philosophy of absolute nothingness is that when we think about comparative philosophy, we think about the comparison, say, of Nishida and Hegel, or Nishida and Kitarō. If we ask from the standpoint of absolute nothingness, all comparisons fall away. It is the incomparable. So insofar as philosophy is concerned with the absolute, it's not concerned with comparisons or with the comparative. But it is exactly this moment of absolute nothingness that, as Nishida says, allows the relative to show itself. And so insofar as we take up this position of absolute nothingness that is beyond all positions, by doing that, we're actually allowed to see the various relative positions, the various comparative positions for what they are, and they're allowed to stand, as Nishida would say, on their own, and to show themselves in their independence. So that was a lot. There's a lot more to talk about here, but I hope you've found this lecture on Nishida's absolute dialetheism stimulating and interesting, and I look forward to the conversation.